I think I hate.
Oh, oh, oh shit. Okay, I guess I'm in for a real fun time here. I'm really gonna have to fight Marcus. I'm gonna fight him to the death because this is my favorite. Unpopular opinion, I actually like Desolation of Smaug more than The Fellowship of the Ring. I think it's a better movie. I don't prefer a lot of the Hobbit films to The Lord of the Rings, but I actually do like Desolation of Smaug more than Fellowship of the Ring. Fight me on that. I'll die on that hill.
I don't know what it is. Maybe I was in a bad mood, but watching this movie made me cranky. Any hope I may have had for this trilogy has completely been washed away. If you ask me, this is where these movies really start to show their true colors, because like I said, the last movie already covered Bilbo's entire character arc.
That isn't true, and I've already explained why.
And unfortunately, we don't really have a lot of ground for this story to cover. Being the middle chunk of the book, this movie only has a few story beats to adapt. And the only things that happen in this part of the book are the following. The dwarves get captured by spiders, the dwarves get arrested by elves, and the dwarves go to the mountain.
And they managed to make that all very exciting. I think all those scenes stand out as being a lot of fun.
That's it. We don't even kill Smaug in this movie. We just need to meet him. Now that's not a lot of stuff for a story. So this is where PJ and the team really started making shit up. In the last movie, they really only added the new orc bad guy and a few other details. But that's not enough. We need more OC. In the original story, Gandalf leaves the group periodically on the adventure because he's a wizard and he's mysterious and he's got shit to do. He's also way too strong, so he'd solve their problems a little too quickly.
That is why J.R.R. Tolkien cut him out of the story for a while, because he would have solved all the dwarves' problems for them. But I do appreciate them expanding on his side of the story in the film.
But hey, we need content for the movie, so let's ruin the mystery and just see what he was doing. So in this movie, he's hunting the Necromancer, who's secretly Sauron. Yeah, Sauron isn't a fucking thing in The Hobbit.
I mean, he isn't in The Hobbit. He wasn't a character that Tolkien had written at the time, but in The Lord of the Rings, he does explain that the Necromancer Gandalf went looking for was Sauron in disguise. That is explained in The Lord of the Rings, so I don't see why it's a problem that they expanded on that in the Hobbit films.
And there's a number of reasons why this doesn't work for me. First of all, The Hobbit is not Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit is a silly, goofy bedtime fairy tale. The Hobbit is basically a collection of bedtime stories that Tolkien would tell his kids. And it does read like that. This is the tale of how Bilbo saved the dwarves from the trolls. This is how Bilbo saved the dwarves from the spiders. This is how Bilbo saved the dwarves from prison. But, Papa, can the dwarves do anything on their own? No. And Tolkien didn't really have the Lord of the Rings fully ironed out when he wrote The Hobbit. The One Ring was just a cool magic ring that Bilbo found. And later he retconned it and made it way more important. And that works, but when you read the book, it's just kind of a ring. They don't talk about how it's literally the most evil thing ever made. They don't talk about the Dark Lord that created it. That would ruin the vibe.
But why not talk about it in the film adaptation? The Lord of the Rings already exists as a film adaptation. Now there is a Hobbit trilogy by the same director. Many years have passed between The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Many years passed between Tolkien writing The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Now that we have the additional context that the ring was created by Sauron and that Sauron was the Necromancer, why should they not touch on that in the Hobbit films, which are designed as a prequel to the Lord of the Rings films? I don't really understand Marcus's complaint here.
Because this is a fun bedtime fairy tale.
But you have other prizes.
The ring? Oh, yes. I'll keep it as a souvenir in a glass box on the mantel.
So here's the issue. Unfortunately, we made the epic, dark, bloody, violent, heart-wrenching fantasy trilogy before we made the predecessor. So instead of committing to making The Hobbit, they tried to just turn The Hobbit into Lord of the Rings. We need it to be a trilogy, and we need world-ending threats. This trilogy is constantly trying to balance the childlike fantasy whimsy of the book with shit like this. You might think this...
I think it does that effectively, because Bilbo is from a very childlike and whimsical world. He lives in the Shire, and the people of the Shire, the hobbits, they don't really concern themselves with the larger world. They don't concern themselves with the affairs of Middle-earth. And this is a story of someone who steps out of his comfort zone and does get involved. He chooses to get involved because he wants to go on an adventure. I don't see what's wrong with them expanding on these elements. The darker elements come in when we learn about Sauron and Thorin's tragic past, how his grandfather was murdered and he lost many of his comrades in arms. I don't get the problem here. He's really failing to explain himself.
A small-scale adventure. The dwarves and Bilbo go to the mountain to stop the dragon and get their home back, but no. Now, in this trilogy, this is one of the most important things that's ever happened. And for that reason, Sauron needs to get involved. He's just here because, well, Sauron's the bad guy in Lord of the Rings. And this is the Lord of the Rings prequel.
I mean, I guess, but they tie him naturally into the story. He has a purpose for being there. The Battle of the Five Armies was orchestrated by him. He is in command of the orcs. It makes sense to me. It lines up.
Oh shit, hold on. The executives gave us notes. They said we need even more characters. I don't know. I mean, we have 13 dwarves. Can we give some of them character? No? Okay. Legolas is here now. People like Legolas, right? I mean, I guess people like Legolas, but here's my hot take for this video. I think he's the worst Fellowship member out of all of the movies. He's easily the least compelling of all of them. He barely has any lines. He kind of just sits around making the same face. Like, bro, you are literally about to die. Could you pretend to care? And I've heard he's better in the books. And that's cool. That's fine. But I don't read books for nerds. I read books for grown-ups. And
I don't know why he'd bother mentioning that, because it really invalidates a lot of what he says in this video when he literally says he hasn't read The Lord of the Rings. If you haven't read The Lord of the Rings, then why are you criticizing The Hobbit for tying into The Lord of the Rings? If you don't have the context of what happens in the Lord of the Rings books. This is such a stupid part of this video. I don't understand his point here. Also, I disagree. I actually think Gimli is the weakest member of the Fellowship, just for the record, because I find some of his comedy to be kind of obnoxious at points. He is a funny character, don't get me wrong, but in The Hobbit, the humor works a lot better because there are 13 dwarves. A lot of them can carry the humorous scenes, whereas Gimli is the only real comedic relief in The Lord of the Rings, aside from Merry and Pippin, who become more serious characters and grow and mature as the story progresses. So a lot of the humor falls on Gimli, and especially towards the end of The Return of the King, I think they kind of assassinate his character a little bit, but that's a topic for a completely different video.
Orlando Bloom a pass on this trilogy because he was a kid, and this was his first gig, and I've seen him do better. But he is not better in The Hobbit. He's really fucking bland.
I mean, yeah, but that's who Legolas is. That's who the elves are. The elves are kind of emotionless and cold. That's what they've always been characterized as. What's your point?
To say it's fully his fault. They didn't really give him anything to do other than fight. And we also got to throw some CGI on his face, because it's been like a decade since we've seen this guy.
I don't think there's CGI on his face. Where are you getting that from? I've watched the appendices. They don't ever talk about adding a CGI to his face. I think you've just made that up. Like, he looks different, I guess, but that's probably due to the lighting, if anything. Where is he getting this idea that they've put CGI on the actors' faces?
Why are you fucking here, man? You're so old. Where's your wife? Go home to your family, dude.
Oh, hold on. Warner said we need more new characters. I mean, again, we have 13 fucking dwarves. Okay, fine, whatever. Kate from Lost is here now. She's an all-new original character. Her name is Toriel. And you know what? Fine. The Hobbit has literally 0 women in this story. It's kind of a sausage fest. I'm not even fully against adding someone new. But you may wonder what her role in the story may be. No, you won't. You will never wonder that, because from her first scene, you know that she is here to be a dwarf's love interest. It is immediately apparent that she is just here to be in a love triangle. And you know, when I read The Hobbit, I thought to myself, this is pretty good, but it really needs a love triangle.
I could have anything on my trousers.
Or nothing.
That was a dick joke. in The Lord of the Rings. Just imagine Tolkien reading that part to his kids. And
I love how he says that after making the same kind of joke. Like, isn't that a bit hypocritical of you?
really the worst thing about this movie is that it's just boring.
What?
At least the last movie wasn't dull. This movie is like unbearable, especially if you're watching the extended
I feel like
cut.
I had a completely different
If you're
experience.
wondering, the extended cut adds extra scenes for the human characters, like the mayor and Alfred. Who's Alfred? Oh, don't worry. We'll get to Alfred later. The only time this movie tries to ward away our boredom is in the infamous barrel sequence. Now,
I love that scene. It's a ton of fun, and they put a lot of work into shooting it. They made this entire rig where all the barrels went around on this set. It's so cool. The amount of effort they put into that, how they merged the CGI shots and the practical shots of the barrels being sent down a river. I love that sequence, especially after knowing the context of how they put it together.
the biggest problem with the action scenes in this trilogy is that they kind of just don't know when to quit. I liked the goblin escape from the last movie at first. After a while, it just keeps going, and it keeps getting more outlandish, and it gets to the point where it doesn't even feel like a movie anymore. It feels like a set piece from an Uncharted game. And the major set piece in this movie is the barrel scene. In the book, Bilbo and the dwarves ride barrels down the river to escape the elves. And that's it. But in this movie, no, that's not enough. So now we have to have the orcs show up and try to kill the dwarves. And we also have the elves show up, and they want to stop the dwarves, but they also hate orcs a little bit more. So it's just a clusterfuck of people fighting each other.
It's awesome.
And then for some reason, there's like shitty GoPro footage. It's like we're on Splash Mountain. And really the most distracting thing about these action sequences is that your suspension of disbelief is just completely destroyed. The characters in this movie are immortal. They survive the most insane shit.
I mean, I guess, but the characters in Lord of the Rings survive a lot of insane shit too.
And as a result, there's rarely ever any tension in this movie. And that's kind
What?
of one of the biggest problems about prequels. We know Legolas isn't gonna die. We know Bilbo isn't gonna die. And that's not to say you can't have tension in a movie where we know the outcome. We all know that Gollum isn't gonna eat
There's
Bilbo,
plenty of
but that
tension
doesn't
in the
mean that that
movie.
scene isn't intense. Because the scene is well written. It was written by someone who knows what he's fucking doing. So the longer you draw out these scenes where the characters are never in any peril and they never take any damage, it just kind of makes me not care.
I love how he says the characters are never in any peril and shows a scene where they are in peril. Like they're literally floating down a raging river while being attacked by orcs and grasping onto whatever weapons they can, doing whatever they can, using their skills and abilities to make their way out of this situation alive. How is that not suspenseful? How are the characters not in peril in this sequence? Please explain that to me.
Why would I give a shit if they're never met with any sort of roadblock? And after this, we get a long...
The scene you just talked about literally was a roadblock. They added a roadblock that wasn't in the book, and I think it's a great scene. It would have been boring. This is a blockbuster film. You want to have some fun action in there, so they took a scene from the book, which was kind of slow and uneventful, and turned it into one of the most exciting action sequences in the entire franchise. I really don't get your complaint here, Marcus.
stretch of very boring plot. I was actually really surprised to see how much movie is left at this point, because nothing happens in this part of the movie. But hey,
What are
we
you talking
gotta
about?
stretch everything out past 2 hours. And yes, I do think it's a very good idea to make Bard a real character, because he's ultimately gonna be the guy who kills the dragon. It doesn't hurt to give him something more to do in this movie. But I don't really need to devote more screen time to seeing his family drama. I don't need to see his rivalry with the mayor. And I don't need to see pointless shenanigans with the mayor and his manservant. Again, we will get to him later.
I love how he just contradicts himself by stating he thinks it's a good idea to give Bard more characterization and give him a more significant role in the story, but then complains about the way in which they do that. I think that the mayor is a fun character. I think Stephen Fry delivered a very fun performance. Alfred is an overused character. I will agree with you on that, but I think the rivalry between Bard and essentially the governing body of Laketown is a significant part of the films. It's important to show that he is a humble character. He is the leader that this town needs. He's a much more humble and noble person than the real leaders in this society. I think that his family dynamic is important. It creates a juxtaposition between him and Alfred. It shows that he has something to fight for, unlike these more selfish, greedy characters. But Marcus doesn't like that. He doesn't explain why. Once again, he doesn't back up his argument here. He says he wants Bard to be given characterization, and then complains about them doing that. How could you have done that better? How would you have done that, Marcus? I really would like to know.
But after all that shit, Bilbo and the dwarves finally fucking go to the mountain, and we can get our one scene that's mostly good. Bilbo and Smaug.
Okay, what do you mean mostly good? This is, honestly, I mean no hyperbole, one of my favorite scenes in all of film. The amount of effort put into it, the motion capture work with Benedict Cumberbatch, Martin Freeman's performance interacting with nothing but a green tennis ball, as they call it in the behind the scenes, is just tremendous. It's a great sequence. I love it. It's a perfect adaptation of the book, but it's only mostly good? Okay, I'm interested to hear why he thinks that.
Much like the last movie, the best scene is the one that they lifted directly from the book, where Bilbo talks to a monster. It's more or less the same exact scene from the book, and because of that, it stands out as being good. I do think it's hilarious just how into this role Benedict Cumberbatch was. They had my man in a mocap suit grinding his coochie on the ground. It looks hilarious, but I gotta give him props. He is giving 200% effort to playing a dragon.
Yep, he did a great job. It's kind of insane how they made a CGI dragon look like Benedict Cumberbatch.
I gotta respect that. It's kind of interesting because this footage let the effects team create a pretty good model for Smaug in this scene, but I think that this was the only scene they had that mocap for. Because later in the movie, for some reason, Smaug just kind of looks like shit. Like, look at this shot. This is straight up unfinished CGI.
I mean, it isn't, but you can think that all you want. I will be fair, they were extremely rushed in production on this film. In the appendices, they're talking about how they were literally up past 3 a.m. trying to finish all the visual effects and whatnot so they could ship the movie out for its proper release date. So they were very limited. They had a very limited time frame, so maybe some of the CGI doesn't look as polished as it could have been, but I still think it looks pretty damn good and a hell of a lot better than any MCU movies we see released today. Also, it's not really true that they only had the motion capture rig for the one sequence of Bilbo and Smaug interacting, because he looks fantastic in his confrontation with Bard at the beginning of the Battle of the Five Armies. But I guess Marcus is only talking about Smaug in this film and not Battle of the Five Armies. He never talks about the sequence with Smaug in Battle of the Five Armies, so I guess he just chose to ignore that, even though the motion capture work is amazing in that film as well.
At his worst, he looks like the dragon from Merlin. And as good as this scene with Smaug and Bilbo is,
this is such a
like
nothing complaint.
That we don't really spend a lot of time with Smaug in this trilogy. And stretching him out into the next movie where all he has to do is die, it's just kind of weird. And
what? Like, he complains that things are dragged out, but then complains that Smaug wasn't given enough time in the films. If anything, he got more screen time than in the book. And you're unhappy about that? For some reason? What is your criteria, dude? Like, I seek to understand what you want out of these films. You don't like them adding things. You also wish Smaug got more screen time, even though they gave him more screen time in the films than the amount of time that was dedicated to him in the book. Okay, sure.
Anticlimactic. They had Doctor Strange grinding his cock and balls against the floor for this. We can devote more screen time to Alfred and the mayor, but we can't give Smaug a little more to work with? Again, this should have just been 2 movies. You can just have Smaug be a small but effective footnote in a larger story.
And he is that. He was always meant to be that. I don't understand your point.
Because with all this padding, the climax of this movie is just a bunch of scenes that were made up because there's no climax in this part of the story. There is no epic Battle of Helm's Deep, so the final conflict of the movie is this. The dwarves decide to confront Smaug, which they don't do in the book, but you know what? I get it. Make the main characters confront the enemy. It's fine. I can accept this.
I like this a lot in the movie. I like that the dwarves actually put up a hell of a fight against Smaug, because in the context of the book, Smaug just kind of runs away and they hide in the mountain while the people of Laketown get torched to death. In the context of the films, you know that they did everything in their power to take him down so that he didn't hurt anyone else, which gives them a lot more agency and improves them as characters, in my opinion.
However, their master plan involves dousing Smaug in molten gold. And it's just another one of those extended action video game sequences where our characters are immortal and can pull off insane feats. The fact that Smaug can't kill a handful of dwarves makes him seem much less intimidating.
Okay, the dwarves aren't immortal. In this case, their skill makes sense because this is their homeland. This is their home turf. They have experience working in the forges. They know how to work their own technologies. So in this case, it's Smaug taking on a group of enemies on their home turf. Obviously, he's going to be outskilled in some regards. He is a pure brute force of nature, but the dwarves know what they're doing. That's why they're so successful in this sequence. That's why they put up as good a fight as they do. I don't understand this complaint. They aren't immortal. They're just experienced with how their own technology and how their own kingdom works. Is there a problem with that?
Also, this looks like shit. But don't worry, because
That isn't a valid complaint. If you haven't noticed, a lot of his complaints in this video are him just saying, this looks like shit. This looks like shit. Okay, you can say that all you want, but it doesn't validate any of your arguments. You haven't substantiated any of your real, arguments in this video. All you've done is say stuff looks like shit, which isn't a valid criticism. That literally means nothing when you don't expand on what you mean by saying that.
this isn't the only conflict we have in the climax. While all of that is happening, we have Feely, Keely, Oin, and Bofer, these nuts, in Laketown, even though they aren't supposed to be there. They're here because earlier, Keely got a wound from a Morgul arrow. Yes, the fucking evil enchanted metal that makes Frodo almost die and turn into a ring wraith. The stuff that the elite Ghoul King uses. Now we are just giving it to normal orcs. So the regular orc shot Keely, and now he's dying. So Sauron sends orcs to go finish off the dwarves because he thinks Thorin and the dwarves are in Laketown. Now, first of all, I just have to say, I don't know why Sauron has beef with a couple of fucking dwarves. I feel like he'd have bigger shit on his mind. And even though
He actually does have bigger shit on his mind. That's why the Battle of the Five Armies happens, because he's planned this out. They literally explain this in the Battle of the Five Armies.
The dwarves were never meant to reach Erebor. Azog the Defiler was sent to kill them. His master seeks control of the mountain. Not just for the treasure within, but for where it lies, its strategic position. This is the gateway to reclaiming the lands of Angmar in the north. If that fell kingdom should rise again, Rivendell, Lorien, the Shire, even Gondor itself will fall.
mountain that Thorin's company wants to get to is right next to Laketown, and logically, it's the next place the dwarves would want to go. That is not where the bad guys look. Oh, and also, Legolas and Toriel show up to help. So now the dwarves, that aren't supposed to be here, have to fight off the orcs that aren't supposed to be here, with help from a guy who isn't even in this book, and a woman who was made up for this story solely so one of the dwarves could have a hot elf girlfriend, And the elves that aren't supposed to be here have to heal the dwarf that isn't supposed to be here because he has a magic evil wound that he shouldn't have because the bad guys who weren't supposed to be here had evil magic weapons that they weren't supposed to be given by the bad guy who isn't even in this story.
Okay, so let's talk about this. Firstly, the orcs weren't sent after the dwarves by Sauron. Obviously, Sauron doesn't have personal beef with the dwarves. Azog has a personal grudge against Thorin, and he sends Bolg, his own son, after him. They try to intercept the dwarves at the Elven Gate at the edge of Mirkwood, but they get away. We are literally shown a scene of the orcs in the same location where the dwarves made dealings with Bard to take them into Laketown. They say that they smell man-flesh, and they deduce from that that the dwarves have been given transportation through Laketown. That's why they go looking for the dwarves in Laketown. That makes perfect sense. I don't see the problem with that. All of it tracks. Also, Bolg isn't just any orc. He's literally an orc commander and the son of Azog, the guy who Sauron has entrusted to lead his army. So, I wouldn't be surprised if he did get his hands on a Morgul weapon of some type, since we do know that the Nazgul, the wielders of Morgul weapons, are in Dol Guldur with Sauron. I'm just making inferences based on the information presented in the film. I will give Marcus some level of credit. It's never explicitly stated how or why Bolg has a Morgul weapon, but it doesn't bother me that much. I can see reasons supporting that, but it's never explained outright. And he also hasn't explained why any of these things are bad or make the film any worse. All he's done here is describe plot lines in the film that have been logically established. It makes sense that the orcs would have tracked the dwarves to Laketown. It makes sense that Tauriel and Legolas would track them down. All of these things make sense in the context of the film. Whether or not they were in the book, it doesn't make the film worse as a film. If he doesn't like them changing things from the book, then that's fine. But he isn't explaining why it makes the Hobbit Trilogy suck. These are aspects of the movies, yes, but please explain to me why they're bad.
Oh, and also, who the fuck is that guy? And
I think he's just an extra, or a stunt double. I guess he briefly appeared in the film.
It'd be one thing if any of this made-up content was interesting, but it's not. In the last video, I didn't really complain about the changes they made in the movies because the changes made for a better overall picture. I don't care about changes. I care when the changes are made out of desperation to add artificial conflict and bring in characters purely for fan service and to stretch out a movie way past its runtime. These changes aren't done in service of a better story. They are done to make the movie longer.
I would argue that a lot of these changes are beneficial to the story. Let's use Legolas as an example. Earlier in the video, he said that he's worse in these films than in The Lord of the Rings. But I'd argue Legolas is given quite a bit of depth in The Hobbit. We understand more about him, how his father is kind of a jerk and his mother died when he was very young. We also see through his somewhat rivalry with Thorin that he does have some level of respect for the dwarves. Although the elves are prejudiced against them and he claims to hate them, we see him continuously saving Thorin. They go back and forth helping each other, and that adds an extra layer to his bond with Gimli in The Lord of the Rings. We know that even though he acts a little bit distastefully towards him on occasion, he did fight on their side in the Battle of the Five Armies. I think a lot of the content with Legolas in The Hobbit adds a ton to his character in The Lord of the Rings.
Legolas and Sauron being in this trilogy adds nothing to the story of Bilbo Baggins.
I mean, fair enough, but you have to understand that Peter Jackson designed the Hobbit trilogy as an addition to The Lord of the Rings, a supplementary story. He changed things, added things that weren't in the book, But he changed those things so everything would flow better as a cohesive story. He didn't just want to adapt The Hobbit as it was seen on the page. He wanted to make it one epic narrative. He wanted to combine the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit films to make them into one 6-movie saga, almost like how the prequel and original trilogies in Star Wars were meant to operate. So you can't purely view the Hobbit films as an adaptation of the book. You also have to view them as an addition to The Lord of the Rings. And as that, I think they work great. A lot of the elements of the Hobbit films tie very naturally into The Lord of the Rings.
The Hobbit. I don't even think Bilbo meets Legolas.
He actually does in this scene.
The north. Where is the north? Exactly.
Ravenhill.
Ravenhill. Thorin is up there.
And this movie really made me realize just how shit this trilogy is. It doesn't feel anything like the source material, and it doesn't even feel like it belongs with the overall series. In my last video, I spent a lot of time praising the simple and effective aspects of storytelling in the original trilogy. And it's because of stuff like this. It's clearly not easy to pace a 3-hour movie appropriately. Even the guy who did it well 3 times in a row can't keep it up under these circumstances. So yeah, this movie stinks, I don't like it, and I don't think I'll ever watch it again. So I'm gonna give it a bad out of 10. Let's see if things can get any worse.
Okay, so I really don't know what to say at this point. I have the polar opposite opinion of him. The Desolation of Smaug is the film that made me see the value in the Hobbit trilogy. I really came to appreciate them as their own story, as well as being an addition and continuation of The Lord of the Rings. It's the film that really solidified them, and funnily enough, he seems to hate it the most. And he claims that it's what made him hate this trilogy. Well, it's what made me love it.